Good morning everyone, my name is Sheikh Umesh and today we're going to have a short discussion and presentation on the research paper that I worked on, which is the impact of COVID-19 on the credit collection process in the UAE. Now, how are we going to understand this? Essentially, we're going to look at how the pandemic affected the economy, how it affected the individuals within the economy, the corporations, how their debt usage and debt financing habits changed, and in the end, you will understand how all of this affected the credit collection process within the UAE. Now, before we get to the hardcore numbers, let us quickly review the literature that was available to me. This includes the information and data. In terms of government information such as GDP, consumer spending, unemployment rate, this was readily available and very easy to use. However, there were areas where one desired greater information, and this would be the breakdown of how individuals and corporations use their debt. Now, what do I mean by this? We know that the individuals took up less and less debt, but we don't have a breakdown of it. We don't know if this debt was credit card debt, installments, mortgages, lease financing. We don't know. This would allow us to understand what the average UAE citizen prioritized. However, this was again, as I said, not available, not published, not collected. I'm not sure. Moving on to the process of shortlisting articles, we made uses of Scopus database, Google Scholar. Google's were used to find relevant work. Keywords such as COVID-19, industry, credit debt, and the paper, of course, is written after extensive search and usage of existing research papers and reports from credible sources. The time period for which this research paper is to be applicable and relevant is from the years of 2019 to 2022. Moving on, what is the legal proceedings for credit collection in the UAE? This, as a result of the pandemic, has not changed a lot. What has changed is the sentiments of the parties involved, which is the creditor and the debtor. We'll get to that later. But for us to understand the holistic picture, we need to understand the legal proceedings itself. Before any courts are involved, the creditor will first send a payment slip to the debtor indicating the desire to get repaid. If this fails, the debt collection lawyers will then reach out to the debtor indicating that the creditor does want to get repaid. If all of this fails, the creditor will then take the debtor to court. Now, what are the exact legal proceedings? Let us take a look at this. I should add a pretext to this. This is something that the creditor wants to avoid at all costs because they potentially lose a customer, and the increased costs that are involved in the legal proceedings, they may or may not be reimbursed for it. Now, the in-depth legal proceedings, we will go through it in a very brief amount of time because, again, we have time constraints, but everything in blue is the court of first instance. Everything in orange is the court of appeal, and the green part is execution. The court of first instance is the first court that hears the trial, hears the grievances, hears both sides, takes in all the submissions, all the documents, and then passes a judgment. If this judgment is something that either of the two parties do not agree with, they can then appeal this within 30 days of the first judgment, and then it will go to the court of first appeal, the court of appeal. This court will then again go through all the submissions, all the documents, and then pass its own judgment. If even after this either of the parties are not satisfied, there's nothing that can be done. This judgment is the final judgment, and this has to be passed. And this will then go through the executionary courts, which will then appoint an executionary judge, who will execute the decisions made by the Court of Appeal. Now, I should add that before any of this takes place, the Ministry of Justice will appoint a reconciliation and settlement committee in order to settle the matter amicably. And if this does not work, then these legal proceedings take place. Now, how will the creditor reclaim the debt that the debtor owes him? There are four ways: either through the property, shares, bonds, real estate, or by the imprisonment of the defaulting debtor. This is something most parties try to avoid because the creditor does not get paid and the debtor goes to jail. Let us quickly look at some statistics to understand the role that debt plays in the UAE. As you can see here, as nominal GDP goes up year after year, the debt taken up by the households also goes up. What this means is, as households within the UAE increase their income, they take up more and more debt to expand their way of life because they become more and more optimistic in their repayment abilities. 47% of the UAE's population is indebted for this very reason. Now, let's look at how the pandemic has affected the economy in depth. And for this, we'll look at four different subheadings. The first one being a statistical understanding of the pandemic on the economy. For this, we'll look at gross domestic product. We will not spend too much time on it, again, for time constraint reasons. All the detailed numericals are present in the research paper, but essentially, GDP goes up year after year for obvious reasons. Commercial activities expand. However, we can see exactly where the pandemic hit, which is right here between March and June of 2020. Between March and June of 2020, a reduction in commercial activities, reduction in trade, reduction in business obviously causes a drop in GDP. The same goes for the growth rate, which fell from 2.5 to 1.6. Moving on to unemployment rate, again, commercial activities decrease, business activities decrease, trade decreases, unemployment increases as companies try and reduce their costs, which should come as no surprise. Unemployment skyrockets. However, unemployment rate, even though it did go up, it was not as bad as the other countries within the world. So the UAE did fare better in this manner. Moving on to consumer spending, which is something that is very closely related to unemployment and GDP, because if you are unemployed, you don't have money to spend, the economy goes down, it's a cycle. So as we can see, consumer spending goes up and up, but in the year of 2020, it falls down. However, the consumer optimism and the consumer confidence in the UAE is something that the government of this country has done way better than other countries. As you can see, 74% of the UAE's population is optimistic regarding the state of the economy in the future, which is not something the other countries can say. Now, this is a very good thing, because if your population is optimistic about the future of the economy, they will invest, they will spend. This will cause a cycle or a chain reaction that will help the recovery process. Now, let's understand how the industries were affected as a result of this pandemic. Let us first start with the tourism industry, which is again one of the biggest industries, 11.6% contribution to GDP. But even then, they were not able to save themselves from the pandemic, and their revenue fell drastically from 180 billion to 86.86 billion. Now, obviously, going online is not an option for them. You cannot have online tourism, which is something that retail industry, which you will see later, does have, and that is one of the reasons why they suffer incredibly hard. Now, moving on to the retail industry, again, a very important, very major industry in the UAE. We all know the UAE as a shopping center of the world. But even though they had the option of going online, they still suffered. The revenue fell from $55 billion to $35 billion, and it would have fallen further if going online was not an option. If this pandemic took place in the 1980s, the extent to which the retail industry suffered would be far, far greater, and there's no doubt about it. Moving on to the shipping industry, as we know, the UAE is geographically gifted. It makes it very important for shipping. But even having said this, they could not save themselves from the effects of the pandemic. Even though they were allowed to operate at a lower scale, their costs went up because they had to deal with COVID compliances, safety protocols, and they had to operate with reduced staff. And the oil industry is very similar in this manner. They also had to operate with lower staff, increased costs, and they suffered the effects of reduced demand. As global commercial activity fell year after year, the demand for oil fell with it, and this causes reduced revenue for the oil industry. Now, one unique advantage that the oil industry has is it is government backed. So this industry will never truly collapse. Like the other industries, like retail stores, if they don't adapt, they're not flexible enough, the retail store is shut down. But the oil industry, these companies, especially in the UAE, which are government backed, will never shut down. They will never fully collapse. Now, moving on to what all this meant by the credit used by these industries. If you reduce your operations, you reduce your trade, you reduce your commercial activities, reduce your staff, you have greater cash on hand. This reduces your dependence on credit lending institutions. Now, what this means is this put managers, regional managers, CEOs in a position they never were before. They were not reliant on credit lending institutions anymore. This allowed them to take decisions that they could not take prior to the pandemic. Now, this all has a ripple effect on the creditors themselves, and we should see this in the slide. Now, even here, in terms of the average resident, they followed a very similar pattern to industries themselves. They were less and less reliant on credit facilities because they were more focused on meeting their immediate costs, such as rent, food, groceries. This made them reduce their extravagant spendings, and hence they reduced their credit lending facilities. As we saw earlier in the PPT, as nominal GDP went up, debt also went up. So as the GDP, as income falls, their incentives to take up debt to have an extravagant way of life will also fall with it. Now, finally, what does this mean for the creditors within the UAE? What this means, essentially, to sum it all up, is a reduced bargaining power position. Prior to the pandemic, the creditors were in an incredible position of power. They decided the terms of payment, they decided when the payment would be made, how it would be made, installments, interest rates, everything. But since demand has fallen, since people are less and less inclined to take up debt, since they are more conservative about the way they spend the money, the creditors themselves are in a difficult position. They now have to reach out to customers. They now have to be open to negotiations. They now have to listen to the debtors. They are more inclined than earlier to reach a solution to difficult situations, arguments amicably without taking them to court. Because as I mentioned earlier, if you take your customers to court, they're not coming back. Now, what does this mean for the future? And what my suggestions would be for future scope of work for industries and individuals alike? The dependence on credit facilities has to be reduced. Growth must be achieved through self-financing, and the creditors themselves have to understand the needs of the debtors. They have to provide better terms and conditions. They have to provide better periods of payment. All of this will allow the UAE to come out of this recession. It will allow the UAE to recover faster. And all in all, that was my presentation. I hope you understood. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. And I hope at the end of the day, you found this useful. Thank you and have a nice day.